All right, we are going to begin today looking at page 106. So please have your books open to page 106 and have your notes out as well. You should be taking notes on the material that we cover on this lesson. I wanted us to pick up on the president's leadership, specifically talking about the powers that the president has. We have covered some of this, so we'll just briefly go through this. I wanted to point out to you that the power that the president currently has grown over time. Okay, the president seems to have more power than originally the president had. Many consider him to be really the most powerful political office in the world, in fact. And really, things have favored that increase in his power. Now, some factors that have really contributed to the increase of the power and the role of the president would be Congress, first of all. Congress has actually given power to the president through legislation. So because of acts of Congress, then the role of the president has become more powerful. Also, national emergencies, especially when you consider a time of war. But anytime there's a national emergency, and we've even seen this with what happens during a pandemic, in that it does seem that during times of emergency that government gets more power, takes upon themselves unprecedented power, and they exercise that, whereas they might not have exercised it previously. And part of that is because people do expect stronger leadership when there are times of crisis. And so if a president is out strong, leading, trying to lead the country through something that's a national disaster, then the people tend to rally together, and that will give perhaps more power to the president. A third thing that has influenced and really increased the power of the president is the welfare state. Now that has very much increased and has changed so much from what our country was originally established on, to where we have our government meeting the needs of so many people in such a way that it was never intended to. But this welfare state has really made many Americans dependent upon the federal government and, in turn, the chief executive. So the welfare state has contributed to the power of the president. And then different presidents over time have just increased the power of the presidency based upon their leadership qualities and their personality as well. In fact, often it is the president's personality that will really be a driving force behind that president's election. But I do want to point out, as your book mentioned, that character is very important in a president. And I think it was a few presidents ago that we started hearing that character is not that important. And that's not true. Character is very important if you want to have good government. Now let's consider some of the constitutional powers. And again, we're just quickly going to go over these because we have already talked about them. The president is the commander-in-chief of the Army, the Navy, and the state militias whenever they are called into service. He also may require a written opinion from his executive officers. He can grant reprieves and pardons. He can fill vacancies when the Senate is not in session, when the Senate is in recess. He is also the one who will inform Congress on the State of the Union. And in that State of the Union address, he will also recommend legislation, most likely to Congress, and he may do that. He may convene and adjourn both houses of Congress. And he receives ambassadors and other public ministers. He commissions all the U.S. officers. He may veto acts of Congress. He may make treaties and appoint offices with the consent of the Senate. And he is to see that the laws of the land are faithfully executed. So many different powers that the president has in the Constitution. And we looked at those in sections 2 and 3 of Article 2. Now, I want us to talk specifically about what we would call his roles. Now, his position is very unusual when you consider his position in the modern world, because most nations, most countries, don't really have their head of state and their head of government vested in the same person. Your book gives you the example of Great Britain. The head of state would be the monarch, the queen at this point, and then the head of the government is actually going to be the prime minister. But in our country, the president has many roles, and let's take a look at these. He's the chief of state, the chief executive, the chief legislator, the chief diplomat, and he is the commander-in-chief. So we're going to look briefly at each one of those roles and see what that involves. As the chief of state, he is the ceremonial head of government and he's the symbol of the national unity. He has three basic ceremonial functions. And so he is the one who's going to make these visits to foreign countries, official state visits. He's going to receive the dignitaries. His inauguration ceremony will be the first of three ceremonial functions that he will have. And of course, you should also remember that it's the 20th Amendment that changed the date for the inauguration. It used to be March 4th prior to the amendment, but as of Amendment 20, the 20th Amendment in 1933, that changed inauguration to January 20th at noon. And then that is where he takes the oath, and his oath, he will say, I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So he takes that oath to defend and protect the Constitution. And so your book tells you specifically about some inauguration events and the Bible that the different various presidents have used, the verses that the Bibles were open to as well. I'll let you look at those in your textbook. The president will also give a short inaugural address. That's going to be a speech, and he will usually just give some main points that he really wants to his new administration to follow. And so your book also points out that most of the presidents have expressed in their inaugural address the need for continual dependence upon God. So after Congress convenes in January, the president will usually give his annual State of the Union address. This is another ceremonial function. And he will give this to the senators and the representatives who will be gathered in a joint session in the House chamber. As you will recall, we talked about that earlier. And so the president is going to report on the state or the condition of the nation and kind of talk a bit about what's going on domestically and foreign issues, and often will recommend some specific legislation, as I mentioned earlier. And so this is normally an outline. The president's budget also will be submitted as well. So the State of the Union address. So we have his inauguration ceremony, the State of the Union address, and then, as we've also mentioned, receiving dignitaries is a third ceremonial function that he has. Of course, he must follow protocol, okay? And that would be the collection of behaviors and ceremonies that are observed by diplomats and heads of state. And your book gives you some examples there. And so he would need to know that because he is the one who will receive the people from other countries, and that's very significant, as we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. So let's talk about his role as chief executive. As chief executive, it's his responsibility to see that the laws of federal government are enforced or faithfully executed. And he has executive orders, which are called the ordinance power. He has that ability to issue executive orders. He can call out the military, as we've mentioned. He can seek the advice of the cabinet, and he has pardoning power as well. And so those are some of the different powers that he has. Let's talk about the pardoning power, though. I should mention, you want to know what the president's cabinet is. That's his panel of advisors that he has. And most presidents keep them as advisors pretty much today. And they might even have very little influence really on the president, and as he may rely more on his White House staff really, but the cabinet is considered the panel of advisors from those departments. But the pardoning power, let's talk about that a minute. We have a few terms under the pardoning power section that I wanted to point out to you. The president he cannot pardon people who are convicted of state crimes, okay? So what we're talking about here with his pardoning power is the ability to pardon for offenses that are against federal crimes, okay? Federal grievances. So only the state government can grant any pardon for state offenses. But the reprieve, which your book mentions, that's going to be the postponement of a sentence. So postponing the sentence would be a reprieve. Pardon would be actually that legal exoneration for a crime. And this will usually be done after the person has been convicted by the court. But your book does mention that the most famous pardon in America's history was actually issued before the accused person was formally charged. 1974, we've already talked about President Ford and Richard Nixon. And Nixon had resigned as president. And so President Ford, as president now, actually pardoned Nixon for any crimes that he might have committed while he was president in connection with that Watergate scandal. Now, part of the pardoning power would be to commute a penalty. Commute would mean that he could reduce a penalty. He might shorten a sentence, lower a fine, and he can also grant amnesty, and that would be a general pardon that would be to a group of people all at one time. And your book does mention a time when President Ford and Carter granted amnesty, and that was to some draft dodgers who had left the United States to escape from serving in the Vietnam War. Now let's talk about the chief executive with his power of appointment. And we're just briefly going to go over this because really we have talked about most of this already. The president has the power to commission officers. In fact, he can commission any officer. He has broad powers in this regard, okay? Appoint the officers of the federal government, because the only offices that are otherwise provided for would be the vice president, those electors, the presidential electors who would be voted by other means, and the House and Senate members and officers, because the Constitution stipulates how those are already supposed to be appointed. And now the law does say that the president may appoint these, a very limited number of these employees may be appointed by the president alone. So these are mostly going to be as personal advisors, White House staff, and many of them will be, some of these officers, the chief officers, will be appointed by him and approved with the consent of the Senate, of course. And that would be things like ambassadors, foreign diplomats, members of the cabinet, chief assistants, federal judges, attorneys, marshals for the United States, heads of the independent government agencies. Now, the president can make temporary appointments without the Senate's approval if the Senate is not in session when the appointment is made. But again, those would be temporary. Now, we've already mentioned the idea of senatorial courtesy. I hope you remember what that is. But that is going to be when if someone has to be nominated for a federal position that might involve service in a particular state, if there is a senator who is from that particular state who has an objection to that person, if that senator is of the same political party as the president who's appointing that person, then the Senate will usually go along with senatorial courtesy, which means because out of respect for that senator who has an objection, they will not confirm that appointment. And then the president also has the power to make appointments to the Supreme Court, as we've already talked about. They are appointed by the president, but as we know in our discussion so far, they must be confirmed by the Senate. And so your book mentions some who President George H.W. Bush, appointed somebody who was very much opposed in the Senate by liberals. And then also, your book mentions Borg President Reagan's appointment of Robert Bork, he pretty much, they rejected that appointment. So that does happen. They rejected his appointment, and we see the liberals, the group like the American Civil Liberties Union and things, lobbying the Senate to defeat Bork and not approve him. And then your book also points out that some of these people that the other people have tried to put out, some of the Democratic presidents, those have gone through without problem. And of course, you know, Kavanaugh was recently, and this, you know, within the last year here, confirmed to the court, and now we're in the process of Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation. So the chief executive does have the power to appoint. The power of removal, he also has the power to remove any that he has the power to appoint, except for the federal judges. He may not remove those, and it says without the approval of the Supreme Court. So he does have the power to remove any people from office that he would have the power to appoint without the approval of the Supreme Court, but the exception, of course, would be the federal judges. He may not remove those at will. Let's talk about his role as chief legislator. Now, he is not part of the legislative branch. Okay, so let's make sure we're clear on that. That is not his role to make laws. Okay, that is the legislature's role. But as chief legislator, he can influence the lawmaking process, and that is set out in the Constitution, his ways that he can influence it or have some kind of impact on the lawmaking. Of course, that first big one is that he has veto power. He can veto a bill, and we've already talked about that, and we won't go through that whole process again. He can also, as we've mentioned regarding the State of the Union address, where he gives his legislative goals, he can also recommend legislation to Congress. He can let them know what he would like passed. And then he may also call special sessions of Congress if necessary. So the president does have a major influence on the agenda, and the agenda means the issues that will be considered and debated in Congress during the coming year. So he has influence in the legislation process, but he is not of the legislative branch, and that is not it's not his job to come up with the laws. All right, as chief diplomat, so really, when you think about American foreign policy, the most important person probably is that president, because he is the chief diplomat. He has the power to extend national recognition to foreign countries. He can propose and ratify treaties, and he can issue executive agreements. And the Secretary of State is the person who would assist him with this. So when you consider what is involved in receiving foreign diplomats, this really is a big deal, because if our president will receive foreign diplomats from other nations, that means he is really putting out there, and it is really apparent that he is recognizing them as a nation. And this is significant because before President Nixon visited China in 1972, and you have a picture of that on page 113 in your textbook, before that happened, the United States refused to recognize the legitimacy of the communist government. You remember from your study of world history that the communist government took control of China in 1949. And at first, America would not recognize the communist China as a nation, the legitimacy of that nation. But when Nixon went to visit China in 1972, that was what gave communist China that recognition, and really it contributed and gave it that respectability in the world as a nation, and really made it possible for it to be developing economically and militarily speaking. Now, the president can also cut off diplomatic relations from a foreign nation. He can request that a foreign diplomat be recalled by his governor. The president may also call home U.S. representatives that we might have in other nations. Your book mentions, though, that that can usually happen if you're looking at war, imminent war coming on. The president also may propose treaties. What is a treaty? A treaty is a formal agreement between nations. Now, when we're talking about treaties, you might have a bilateral treaty, which would be a treaty between two countries signing this. Two countries would be signing that treaty. You might also have what we call a multilateral treaty, which would be 3 or more countries signing that treaty. Your book mentions the most famous treaty to be signed in recent times as being START, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. And this was a multilateral treaty because we had the United States, Russia, the Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan signing it in 1992. So that's the most famous one on Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. And we talked about yesterday in class, Wilson's Treaty of Versailles. And sometimes the Senate can refuse to ratify a treaty, okay? They can, and this is the most famous refusal that we have. And occasionally the Senate does refuse to ratify a treaty, but we do need the treaties ratified by the Senate, as we saw from our example with Wilson that we looked at last year. The president often today, though, will not really enter into a formal treaty, but rather an executive agreement, and that would be just this informal agreement that the president and a leader of a foreign nation or their representative would make together. And usually the Senate doesn't really try to interfere in carrying out terms of those executive agreements there. I want you to write treaty down as your word when you are done with this video. Treaty. Commander-in-Chief. As Commander-in-Chief, we talked about this yesterday too. He controls the military forces of the federal government. He can call out the National Guard as well, state militias. And notice that as Commander-in-Chief, he's responsible to see that the law is being carried and that we have peace domestically and from the foreign perspective too. So that just does not mean on the borders and from foreign invasion or foreign enemies, but also domestic peace within our country. Only Congress can appropriate funds, however, for armed forces, and only Congress can declare war. So he may call out the military forces, state militias, but it's Congress that gives the funds, and it's Congress that declares war. And so that's the significant thing about being commander-in-chief there. Congress also has passed the War Powers Resolution of 1973, and that was designed to limit the time that a president could keep the American forces involved in a foreign conflict without the approval of Congress. So you might think, well, why did that happen? Well, because even though Congress can only declare war, Congress can declare war, the president can send troops into combat without an official declaration of war. And many presidents have done that, as a matter of fact. In wartime, Congress grants a president actually more extensive military powers than he has in peacetime. And in the age in which we live, of course, the nuclear age, it really is important for our nation's defense that the president can have the power to take aggressive military action without the wait for approval of Congress at times. But as you can imagine, people have become concerned that presidents have become too independent of Congress, and that has taken, remember I said that the president's power, one thing that's caused that to increase is national emergencies such as war. And so this is one of the concerns there. So that is why after the United States' long involvement in the Vietnam War, which, by the way, if you remember this, it was fought without a congressional declaration of war. Congress did not declare our country to be at Vietnam War. So that is when Congress passed the War Powers Resolution, which limited from 60 days to 90 days the time that a president could keep American forces involved in that foreign conflict without the approval of Congress. Now, that concludes our lesson today. You already have your homework, so I won't be giving that out for you, and I will see you tomorrow in class.